Hi, my name is Megan Bulland. I am a forestry technician here in the forestry department at UK. I work with Dr. Ellen Crocker, as she said, in the Forest Health Lab. And we're going to be talking today about common landscape tree health issues. So if you have questions as we're going along, I would encourage you to please drop them in the chat box, and I'll try to answer questions as they come up as best as I can. So let's get going and talk about tree health in the landscape. And we will be focusing mainly upon landscape issues in your trees that are in your lawn, in your yard, not woodland trees. So trees in urban environments versus trees in environments tend to have very different sets of issues that might affect their health. And what we're going to be focusing on today is specifically trees in urban environments like the trees in your yard. All right, so go ahead and get going. If I can get Zoom to work. There we go. All right, so we're going to cover a few different groups of concerns that you might often see in your landscape trees. We're going to break this down into different groups of insects and pathogens. But what I would really like you all to take away from this presentation today is that there are different concerns that you might see in trees in your landscape, but really there's a lot that you can do to help the health of your landscape trees too. And we're going to be revisiting these same tips and tricks to help you keep your landscape trees healthy for a really long time as we go through this list of different concerns and issues that you might face, so that you can keep your trees healthy for years to come and maybe see where some of these issues might be stemming from. All right, so first we're going to be talking about foliar pathogens. Foliar pathogens are bacterial or fungal infections that are going to be impacting the leaves or the needles of your trees. Foliar pathogens are very rarely a concern for very healthy trees. They sometimes occur during periods of very high rain or humidity. So here in the Southeast, we see these a lot during the summer, especially as we progress into July and August when we have really high humidity and high temperatures. You'll often see a lot of these foliar issues crop up on your trees. They might be more common on trees that are already stressed in the landscape. So very often trees that maybe are planted in the wrong location. Maybe you have a tree that likes full sun and you have it in an area that gets a lot of shade. That could be a precursor to some foliar issues. Or maybe a tree that is experiencing stress from drought or from soil compaction might also be more predisposed to developing some of these issues. So understanding the location of a particular species and what those preferences might be are helpful things to consider when you're trying to prevent these issues in your trees. A lot of foliar pathogens can be vectored by insects, insects that feed on the sap inside the leaves of your trees, and they will often vector some of these foliar pathogens as well. But very rarely are foliar issues of serious concern for healthy trees. And that's something that I'd like you all to keep in mind, is like maple tar spot, which is seen in the picture here, is very rarely a concern on a healthy maple tree. It's a cosmetic issue. And when you see it, especially in the late summer, that tree has already had a lot of good months of growth with nice healthy leaves to take up a lot of good photosynthetic material and store those nutrients for the rest of the year. So that is going to very rarely be a concern for that tree because it's just cosmetic, it's on the surface, and it's probably, with a couple exceptions, which we'll talk about, not going to really affect the health of your trees too much. So powdery mildew is a good example of a foliar pathogen that we see a lot in landscape trees around here. This is a fungal pathogen, and so it's feeding upon the tissues of that tree leaf. It's where the fungus is deriving its energy from. This is what most foliar pathogens that are fungi do. It's not a particularly serious issue on its own, but it can lead to stress in landscape trees. And it's most often an issue on trees that are heavily shaded because fungi like those moist, shaded conditions. It's a very habitable environment for them, and trees that are in those conditions are a more favorable environment for powdery mildew. Particularly problematic species for powdery mildew around here in our area are ornamental dogwoods, ornamental lilac trees, maple, and apple. And I see this especially on the dogwoods and the lilacs. They're the biggest culprits that I run across as far as trees. A lot of shrubs have this issue too. But as far as trees in our area, the dogwoods and the lilacs very often are impacted by powdery mildew. And as we said, it's not usually a serious problem. As long as that tree isn't impacted by something like powdery mildew all year, year after year, it's probably not going to be much more than a cosmetic issue for a nice, healthy tree like this. Bacterial leaf scorch is another foliar condition that we'll see on trees in our area. And unlike powdery mildew, bacterial leaf scorch can be serious. As the name suggests, bacterial leaf scorch is a bacterial infection, and it's vectored or transmitted by leafhoppers and other insects from tree to tree. It occurs primarily on oak trees. Some other trees are susceptible as well, but in our area, oak trees, especially pin oaks and some of those other red oak species, are the primary trees that are impacted by bacterial leaf scorch. Symptoms tend to develop mid to late summer when trees might already be experiencing drought stress and other forms of environmental stress. And these symptoms might be exacerbated by these stressful conditions. And there is no effective treatment, unfortunately, for bacterial leaf scorch. Once a tree has this infection, you can't get rid of it. There are essentially treatments out there that can help prevent bacterial leaf scorch from getting worse for a while. They're like antibiotic treatments. But unfortunately, there isn't any treatment that can cure this infection in your trees. And if you want to treat your trees for bacterial leaf scorch, you'll need to keep applying that same treatment on a regular basis for the rest of that tree's life. Now, that's not to say that bacterial leaf scorch is an immediate death sentence for your trees either. Proper pruning, proper mulching and watering, especially during the heat of the summer, can really mitigate the symptoms and stress of bacterial leaf scorch on your oak trees, and it can really prolong the life of infected trees by quite a few years. So even though bacterial leaf scorch might ultimately lead to the demise of these trees, it's not going to be immediate, and you can have quite a few good years out of an infected tree before you might have to consider removing and replacing an infected oak tree. And diplodia tip blight, switching gears just a little bit from hardwood trees with broad leaves to conifers. Diplodia tip blight is found in our area most commonly on landscape pine trees and other conifers. This isn't something you're going to see on your oaks or your maples or your dogwoods, but coniferous trees, pine trees, and others are susceptible to diplodia tip blight. It's a fungal pathogen, and it infects the needles and new shoots of these landscape pine trees. Infected foliage tends to become stunted, turn brown and die, and there's a lot of resin production from infected tissue. So often you'll see where all of those needles actually become stuck together with this resin that is exuding from these infected portions of the tree. The disease moves from the bottom upwards in infected trees, and there really isn't much that you can do about this one, unfortunately, with diplodia tip blight. Again, it's one of those that there's really not a very effective treatment, but with diplodia tip blight, the take-home message here is that this this pathogen infects trees that are not really in the right spot. So there's a lot of pine trees that we probably shouldn't be growing in this area. This isn't really the ideal place for them, and they get stressed in our environmental conditions because this isn't their natural area. So the stressed trees are much more likely to be susceptible to something like diplodia. Some of the native pines we have that do well in our area, and there's one or two, but not many because we mostly have hardwoods around here in the bluegrass. But those native pines are probably less likely to be stressed and therefore less likely to be infected with diplodia than some of these other landscape conifers that do become stressed with these infections over time. Moving on from foliar pathogens, we're going to talk about issues that affect the branches and trunk of your tree, that main woody tissue of the tree. And these branch or trunk cankers can be bacterial or fungal. And much like foliar pathogens, branch and trunk cankers are more common on stress trees. And they can also be exacerbated by mechanical damage. Things like weed eater damage or lawnmower damage or someone backing into a tree. It opens up a wound in that tree. And that wound is a perfect entry point, just like a cut on your body. That wound is a perfect entry point for infectious agents to get into that tree and cause canker damage. Branch cankers aren't so serious. You can usually prune them out and they might not be an issue, like black knot on this cherry tree here. You might be able to prune out this fungal infection and the tree could be perfectly okay. You might be able to manage the disease even if you can't get rid of it entirely. But trunk cankers can be very serious. A trunk canker is on the main body of the tree, that main stem. And once that canker is there, you can't get rid of it. And if that canker advances and becomes large enough, it may disrupt all of the vascular tissue of that tree, which is like the equivalent of your veins and arteries running through your body that move your blood along. A tree has this vascular system that moves nutrients through the tree. And much like your body, if that system is constricted and that flow is cut off, it can be very serious. And cankers on the main trunk of your tree may lead to tree death if they progress far enough. A bacterial or fungal canker called gummosis is very common on a lot of our cherry, peach, and plum landscape trees. These infections often are characterized by a lot of resinous sap that flows from the branches and trunks of infected trees. You've probably seen this on cherry trees or plum trees in our area. It's pretty common. And it's very common on stressed landscape trees in these groups. Now, another thing to keep in mind with something like this canker is that these groups of trees that it primarily infects, cherry, peaches, plums, they're not super long-lived trees in a landscape setting. They're short-lived ornamentals and they don't have a really long life like our oaks or some of our other larger trees do. So this bacterial or fungal gummosis that appears on these trees, very often these trees are already stressed and they may be older trees as well that are just nearing the end of that natural progression of the lifespan of a tree in this group. So although bacterial gummosis can be unsightly and it may lead to a lot more stress in the tree, it's not really something that we treat. And it's more a signal that there's probably other signs of stress or increased age that's going on in trees in these groups that is leading to this bacterial or fungal canker. Cytospora and Ceridium cankers, you'll see these a lot on spruce trees around here. These cankers girdle the branches of spruce trees. They can cause needles to brown and drop, and branch dieback often occurs from the interior of the tree outward. This is accompanied by a lot of resin and oozing from cankers on these trees. And this primarily impacts spruce trees in our area. And one of the reasons for this, as we've kind of been circling back to, is that there's usually a lot of stress in spruce trees, especially blue spruce trees in the landscape in Kentucky. Blue spruce doesn't really belong here. It's a tree of the Rockies, of the Western US. It thrives in places like Colorado, where the temperature and the climate is very, very different. It doesn't really do well in the high heat and high humidity of the southeastern US and of the bluegrass here in Kentucky. So very often blue spruce trees are a prime target for Cytospora and Ceridium cankers because they are already stressed. This just is not the place for them. They don't thrive, and so they're very susceptible to these kinds of infections. This is also a case where very often these chemical treatments that might be available are not really going to be very effective. And you might want to consider, if you already do have these kinds of spruce trees on your landscape, to approach this from a cultural perspective instead, meaning that you want to make changes that aren't chemical, to promote the health of your tree. And this could involve pruning out interior branches to increase airflow through your tree. This might help prevent those fungal infections from taking hold. And planting blue spruce trees, if you really feel that you need one, in an area where that tree is going to get a lot of good airflow. Don't plant it right up against the side of the house or in the corner of the yard where there's a lot of other trees around, because that lack of good airflow is really going to make it a prime target for these kinds of infections. With all of that nice still air sitting around it, it's a perfect target for fungal infections like this. And Phomopsis canker is another canker that we will see around here. This one more often on juniper and arborvitae. It's usually a foliar pathogen that may develop into cankers on the branches. Generally, this one is more of a cosmetic issue, although in some cases it can lead to tree death. Branch dieback is usually much more common. And it's characterized by this browning of the needles, usually from the tips of the branches inward, and that kind of gradual dieback of those branches as the cankers start to develop after the foliar pathogen takes hold. Vascular wilts are a series of usually fungal infections that can be found in trees. And unlike some of the other things we've talked about where they can be cosmetic, or maybe there's things that you can do to help mitigate them, pruning out dead branches, things like that, with some of the cankers we talked about, vascular wilts are serious and they are very difficult to treat if you can treat them at all. And they're often a sign of this tree needs to be removed and something else needs to be replanted here that does not belong to the same species or the same group of plants, the same family of plants as what was there before. They're usually fungal or bacterial infections of the vascular tissue, and the vascular tissue is what we were already talking about. It's that system underneath the bark of a tree that transmits nutrients all through the tree, much like your own blood vessels do. So that vascular system, when it becomes infected and impacted by a pathogen, it gums up that vascular system and it prevents that flow of nutrients from occurring, and very, very often can lead to tree death. Verticillium wilt is one of the primary wilt pathogens we have in infecting landscape trees here in Kentucky. And pathogens that infect the vascular tissue cause dieback and death in infected trees. We'll also talk about Dutch elm disease for a minute, which can impact American elm trees here in our area. But verticillium wilt affects a wide range of tree species. Symptoms can include leaf yellowing, leaf scorch and browning, branch dieback, dieback of infected tissue, and sometimes it can even lead to tree death. Verticillium wilt can be a very serious infection in these trees, and it's not an infection that you can treat. There is no cure for verticillium wilt. I would recommend, if you believe that you have this in your trees, it's a case of removing an infected tree and replacing it with something that is not going to be impacted by verticillium wilt. And there are species of landscape trees we have that won't be impacted by this infection. But verticillium wilt is a vascular infection in landscape trees, and it can be a rather serious one. If you believe that you have this infection in your landscape trees, I would really recommend contacting a professional, a certified arborist who might be able to take samples if necessary, or might be able to confirm through a visual diagnosis whether or not it might be verticillium wilt that is impacting your landscape trees, because there are visual cues that you can look for, like this discoloration in the tissue of the tree, that brown staining. That's a classic symptom of a lot of vascular infections, will be brownish discoloration inside the cambial or vascular system of that tree. And that's something that an arborist might look for. They might look for staining inside the tree to see if possibly there is a vascular wilt like verticillium wilt impacting your tree. Dutch elm disease is the other vascular wilt that we have in the area that you might see on your landscape trees. But you're only going to see this on American elms or European elm trees. It's a fungal pathogen. It's carried by elm bark beetles. So they're these tiny little beetles. They carry this fungi around with them. And when the beetles move to a new tree, they take the fungi with them. The fungi make a wonderful home there in the vascular system of the tree. It's a wonderful, habitat for those fungi to grow in and thrive. But unfortunately, that infection stresses and ultimately kills infected elm trees. The onset of symptoms can be very, very rapid with this infection, and trees may decline and possibly even die within the span of a single growing season in really serious infections. There are preventative treatments available for Dutch elm disease, and they do work, but they have to be repeated regularly every year, every couple years for the rest of the life of that tree. So if you're concerned about something like Dutch elm disease as an infection in your trees, that's something to keep in mind, that there are treatments out there, but they're costly and they have to be repeated, or else the effectiveness does not remain with the tree of that treatment. Wood-boring insects, we just talked about the little elm bark beetles that vector Dutch elm disease, so this is a perfect segue into wood-boring insects. These are insects like that elm bark beetle that bore into trees to make their home there, to feed, or to rear their young. And they can, in some cases, impact the health of trees on their own, although in other cases, like that elm bark beetle, they impact the health of trees by carrying infectious agents, fungi or bacteria with them that can then infect trees. They're primarily beetles, but there are a few exceptions, and we'll talk about one of them. And they may be native insects, or they might be invasive species. Some of these only impact stress trees. There are some bark beetles that will usually only be seen on landscape trees if those trees are already really stressed. Now, this is landscape trees. Trees in a forest setting can be very different. In the southern US, southern pine beetle is known to heavily impact the health of pines throughout the southeast in a forest setting. Here in the bluegrass, in a landscape setting, it's often only stressed trees that are really going to be impacted by most of these wood-boring insects, although there are a few exceptions that will impact healthy trees as well. And very rarely is treatment practical for these situations. We'll talk about a couple of exceptions, but very often, since these are stress trees that are attractive to wood-boring insects, simply caring for those trees, proper mulching, proper watering, those are things that you can do that will probably prevent you from having issues with wood-boring insects in your trees, or at least reduce the likelihood of you having issues with these wood-boring insects in your trees if you properly care for those trees and reduce any stress that they might be under. But an exception to this rule about reducing stress is definitely the emerald ash borer. Most of you have probably heard of emerald ash borer, or EAB. It's an invasive insect, non-native and introduced from Asia in the early 2000s, that kills white and green ash trees throughout the southeastern US. The larvae feed within the tree and they damage that tree's vascular system that we've talked about. And that damage from larval feeding leads to branch and leaf wilting and dieback, and with very few exceptions, most trees, especially landscape ash trees, are going to die within a few years of infestation with emerald ash borer. And EAB has wiped out a large expanse of our ash population throughout the eastern US, just because it is so effective, unfortunately, at killing these trees. There are treatments available for EAB, and they are really effective for your landscape trees, but like other things that we've talked about, they have to be repeated every few years to remain effective. But if you have a really large ash tree in your landscape that you're really attached to, it's a beautiful tree, it provides a lot of shade for your property, there are effective treatments out there that can work. Now, if you have smaller ash trees, I would almost recommend sometimes considering removal and replacement with something that isn't an ash tree, rather than treating that tree every couple years forever. possibly to prevent it from being infected with emerald ash borer. And there are a lot of nice options out there for replacement trees for ash in your lawns and as street trees. There's a lot of really lovely native species we have that make excellent replacements for ash that you can consider. Clearwing borers are another type of borer that can impact landscape trees. And although most borers are going to be beetles, these guys are an exception. These are little moths that kind of resemble wasps. So they're actually in that same family with butterflies and the big pretty moths that you think about, but they're these tiny little moths that look more like a wasp than they do like any kind of a moth. The larvae, much like with the emerald ash borer, bore into the trees and cause damage. And they're primarily associated with landscape trees like dogwood, ash, lilac, and some of your ornamental plums and cherries, things in that prunus group. And like some other things we've talked about, clearwing borers are more likely to impact stress trees. You'll see a lot of that wilting and dieback of branches and the crown dieback from infection with these clearwing borers. And very often there will be brown sawdust or frass on the trunks and branches of infected trees. Now, these insects, these clearwing borers, they're very often found on stressed trees. So if you can mitigate stress on your landscape trees, you're very, very likely to have less of a problem, or less likely to have a problem with these clearwing borers infecting your trees. So proper mulching, proper watering, those will go a long way towards reducing the impacts of stress on your tree and helping them be more resistant to these kinds of infections. You might also want to consider that, like we were talking about earlier with the bacterial gamosis, that impacts a lot of our cherries and plums, dogwoods, lilacs, and these ornamental prunus species. They're not really long-lived trees. They tend to have short lifespans on the landscape, and that's just the nature of how they are. So very often stress in these trees might actually just be a result of advancing age and the fact that these trees might not live forever, and it might just be time to replace them if you're really having issues with this. Bark beetles. We already talked about bark beetles a little bit. They're found on many species of pine trees. They're generally associated with stress, and adult and larval activity under the bark can damage the conductive tissue of that tree, just like we've talked about with emerald ash borer and the clearwing borers. These are primarily found on pine trees. There are a couple exceptions that will impact some of our broadleaf trees, but bark beetles are primarily found on pine trees. And the symptoms include needle browning, branch dieback, and a lot of sawdust-like material coming from the bore holes on the trunk of the tree where the beetles have entered the tree, or where adult beetles have exited. Proper watering and mulching can limit environmental stress that might make trees more susceptible to bark beetles, but there really aren't any effective treatments available for most of the bark beetles that impact pine trees, and removal and replacement with a different kind of tree is usually going to be your best option with these insects. Foliar pests are, much like the foliar pathogens that we talked about, not usually a death sentence for landscape trees, although they can lead to some unsightly damage. Foliar pests feed on leaves or needles of trees and shrubs. Feeding usually occurs in the larval stage. So it's not often adults that are doing this feeding damage. It's the larvae that are feeding on the leaves and on the needles of your landscape trees. And very rarely are they going to be a serious issue. Good cultural approaches like mulching and watering will help reduce stress on the trees, so the stress of the foliar pest feeding is going to be greatly reduced if the tree isn't dealing with other environmental stressors in addition to these foliar insects that might be feeding. Chemical treatment, it's not usually necessary with these guys. You know, maybe they look kind of unsightly, maybe they make the tree look a bit raggedy for a moment, but very, very rarely are these guys going to kill your tree. And the chemical treatments usually just aren't going to be necessary in this case. Although I would recommend not fertilizing these trees that are infected with foliar pests or that have foliar pests on them. That flush of new growth that comes from fertilizing trees is perfect, young, delicious tissue that these little foliar insects are just going to love chewing on. So while you might think that fertilizing your trees is going to make them healthier, and help them deal with the stress, this might be one of those occasions where you don't want to fertilize your landscape trees when you have these foliar pests feeding on the leaves and needles, because it can actually lead to more stress in these trees as time goes on. Aphids are one example of a foliar pest on landscape trees. And you've probably seen aphids or seen some of the telltale signs of their presence on your trees. Aphids feed on plant sap. So they have these little tiny mouth parts that are like a straw that they've used to pierce the leaves of trees. And with these mouth parts, they pull sap and nutrients out of the leaves or needles of the trees that they're feeding on. Feeding damage of aphids might resemble discoloration or stippling on the leaves of trees, leaf distortion, or possibly early leaf drop. And some of the evidence of aphid infestation, and you've probably seen this on your cars or maybe on the sidewalks in the summer, is this sooty mold, this black sooty mold that becomes evident from the aphid feeding. And that's not the aphids themselves. They're not the black sooty material. What that sooty mold is the honeydew from the aphids feeding. It's a substance that the aphids excrete that has a lot of sugars in it. And those sugars are really attractive to fungi that feed on the sugars in the honeydew and lead to that black sooty mold. So that sooty mold isn't really impacting the health of your tree. It may be really unsightly, but it's not doing anything. It's just feeding on the honeydew produced by the aphids that are feeding on your trees. But generally not a cause for concern. Treatment is very rarely needed for aphid infestations. They're a cosmetic issue. As we keep on saying, mulch your trees, water your trees, especially during the heat of summer, to reduce the stress of something like an aphid infestation. But very, very rarely is treatment going to be necessary for the health of your trees in a case like this. Bagworms are another good example of a foliar pest that we see a lot on landscape trees. This is one that I've gotten a lot of questions about in the past, is these little, chrysalis type things that are hanging off of your landscape trees like junipers, arborvitae, and other conifer trees. The larvae create these really distinctive cocoons that people often see on their trees. They're very obvious to the eye, and so usually people will see these and say, hey, what is this on my tree? And it's the larvae of these bagworms. They have these very distinctive cocoons, and they feed on the foliage of these landscape conifers. And again, very rarely is chemical treatment going to be necessary with these guys. I understand they are unsightly, they don't look particularly nice, but in light infestations, they can usually be removed by hand. I've done this before. You have a bucket of water and you just take bags off either by hand or with a little pair of pruning shears and just throw them all in there. It's disgusting, but at least you're not putting a bunch of chemicals on a tree that doesn't really need them, if you really want those bagworms to be gone. In light infestations, unless they're bothering you, if you feel that they're really unsightly, but unless they're really bothering you, I would say that really no treatment at all is needed for light infestations of bagworms. In heavy infestations, there are treatments that are available, but timing is really key with these guys. You have to time any kind of chemical treatment for bagworms to be at the right stage of the larval development. Once those larvae reach a certain size, they're going to be largely resistant to any kind of chemical treatment that you might try to employ. So if you have a really heavy infestation of bagworms, or if you have a lot of conifers that are being infested with bagworms, I would really encourage you to reach out to a professional, a certified arborist or another tree care professional who might be able to help you gauge the exact time when you want to be treating for bagworms to be assured that any treatment you employ is effective. And again, proper mulching, proper watering is going to help reduce the stress on landscape trees of being infected with something like bagworms. The last foliar pest we're going to talk about is tent caterpillars. Eastern tent caterpillar, forest tent caterpillar, and fall webworm are 3 species of foliar pests that are all lepidopterans. They're butterfly or moth family members, and they are native species. So these guys aren't invasive, even though they can look really unsightly and possibly a little alarming. They're not invasive species. They're native species that feed on a number of different species of native trees in our area. They might defoliate portions of the canopy of your trees, and these species all create distinctive tents as larvae that are going to be visible either in the crotches of tree branches, like you see here, or up surrounding the leaves of trees on a branch. You might find them creating this tent-like web surrounding leaves and on a branch of a tree. But very rarely are they a cause for concern. On smaller trees, infestations might be able to be pruned out on branches, but very rarely are these guys going to hurt the tree in any way. They're only there for a short period of time during the year, so they won't be around all year long. And once the larvae are done feeding, once those larvae mature, then you won't have them around anymore. Now, once in a while, there is a year where you have really large population booms of one of these species, and you might see really high levels of them. But this doesn't happen every year. It's not a yearly occurrence, and very rarely are any of these species going to heavily impact the health of your trees. They might just be very visually unsightly for a while. Scales are a common issue on landscape trees that people will ask about, because scales, there's so many different species of them. And we're not going to talk about any specific species of scale today. Scales are insects that feed on the sap inside the branches and leaves of trees, much like the aphids we talked about. They have those little piercing straw-like mouth parts that they'll insert into the tree and feed on the tree's nutrients. They're more common on stressed landscape trees, and scales are one of those instances where I really want to, emphasize that stressed trees are going to be more susceptible to scales, and they're also going to be more heavily impacted by infections of scales on the tree itself. So if you can reduce stress by proper mulching, proper watering, it's really crucial to helping to mitigate stress on landscape trees, to help either prevent scale infestation or reduce the impact of a scale infestation on your tree. Because scales can be really, really difficult to treat. Much like the bagworms we've talked about, scales, timing is crucial for effective treatment of scale infections. Once these insects progress to a certain stage of development, they become largely resistant to most treatments that you might use on them. Those mobile adults, those adults cement themselves to the leaves or the branches of trees. They are very rarely mobile, and once they reach that adult stage, it's very difficult to treat them. So the younger stages, the immature stages, are when you really want to try to treat for scale infections, when they're still moving around before they cement themselves to those branches. And again, this is another one of those cases where you want to consult a professional, because treatments, if you do decide to treat, must be really precisely applied. The timing is crucial, and you really need to know what species of scale it is that you're looking at and understand where it is in its life cycle in order for any treatment to be effective. But proper watering, proper mulching is really going to help reduce the impacts of any stress that might be brought on by scales on your landscape trees. Galls, these are primarily a cosmetic issue on trees for the most part. Galls are not they're not a pathogen, and although they are caused by an insect usually, they're not an insect itself. A gall is an irregular growth of plant tissue. It's a reaction that occurs between natural hormones in the plant and chemicals produced by an insect. So an insect comes along, it feeds on or bites the leaves or branch of a tree, and it inserts these chemicals into the tree that cause this reaction to occur with the natural hormones in the plant tissues and creates these abnormal growths that we call galls. Galls might provide food or shelter for an insect or for an insect's young to grow and reproduce, and they can occur on almost any part of the plant. they're usually only an aesthetic issue. Very rarely are galls going to require any kind of management, because while they might look a little odd or unsightly, very rarely are they going to impact the health of your trees. If you do have a heavy gall infestation, mulching and watering to reduce stress on the trees is going to go a long way towards helping your trees through that infestation. And especially with leaf galls, it's important to remember that when those leaves drop from the tree, the galls will be gone and they won't reappear next year. So just because you happen to have galls on your hackberry leaves one year doesn't necessarily mean that they will be there for certain the following year once those leaves drop. And that goes for a lot of the foliar pathogens that we talked about too. Once your trees drop those leaves for the fall, raking those leaves to help remove the pathogen from under the tree is helpful, but it's not certain that your tree will have that same foliar pathogen the following year. Foliar issues are less likely to be permanent than diseases or insects that impact the trees and primary trunk of your tree, the branches and primary trunk of your tree. Oak galls are one of the more common galls that we see around here. Oak galls, as we talked about, there's an irregular growth of plant tissue, and they form on oak twigs and on the branches of oak trees. Light infestations are usually what we see, and these can be pruned out, or usually you don't have to do anything at all with these galls. But there are some cases in which oak gall infections can become a bit out of hand. And you'll see this sometimes on landscape oak trees that are in really stressful conditions. Trees that are in parking lots, trees that are under a lot of drought stress or maybe have a lot of soil compaction might become severely impacted by these oak gall infestations. So mulching trees and watering trees to reduce stress can really help mitigate the impacts of gall infestations on your trees. Abiotic conditions, these are conditions on your trees that aren't caused by any kind of insect or any kind of a disease. These are environmental conditions. And so they're caused by things in that plant's environment that are leading to stress in the tree. And very often abiotic conditions might go hand in hand with some form of biotic condition, something caused by an insect or caused by a disease. These are often precursors and stressors that can lead to other problems down the line. And I would say that by far and large, a lot of the issues that you do see in your landscape trees are abiotic conditions that, if left alone for long enough, may lead to other problems. These guys are usually the first signs of stress in your landscape trees and are really something to keep in mind and look out for. Very often we think about insects and diseases as being the culprits that are hurting our landscape trees, but very, very often it's actually these environmental or abiotic factors that are far more likely to create stressful conditions in your trees and actually be the issue that might lead to stress in your trees to begin with. So if we can reduce the impact of abiotic stressors, we improve the health of trees overall. And some of the abiotic conditions that can be very stressful in landscape trees include the wrong planting site or wrong planting technique. We plant a lot of trees under power lines that don't belong there. You wouldn't want to plant a giant oak tree under some low power lines because eventually that's going to be a problem. Planting trees incorrectly, either planting trees too deep or too shallow, can be very stressful for the tree. You can lead to girdling roots that will wrap around the tree and constrict that vascular system that we keep on talking about. This can happen when trees are planted incorrectly, and that can lead to a lot of stress as that tree grows and matures. Or even improper mulching, like we see in this picture here. Someone heaped way too much mulch around the base of this tree. Mulching, while I keep on stressing that it's important for the health of your landscape trees, needs to be done properly, because improper mulching can be very detrimental to trees as well. And if you have any questions about mulching techniques, I would encourage you to ask, because this is something that needs to be done properly for the health of landscape trees, and I'm happy to answer any mulching questions that you all have. And planting trees too deep or too shallow, like this poor little guy, you can see that he has no roots whatsoever. And that's probably a result probably of several different factors, but part of it most likely being improper planting technique that led to stress and ultimately the death of this little tree. Mechanical damage we've talked about before with cankers. Mechanical damage is caused by things like lawnmowers, weed eaters, someone backing the car up into the tree. They can lead to infection sites for cankers and other infectious agents. And they can also just impact that tree with a lot of stress that might lead to other problems down the line. So being aware of the potential for mechanical damage that is seen very, very often on landscape trees, usually from weed eaters or lawn mowers, and trying to prevent that mechanical damage by mulching well around the base of your trees to keep things like weed eaters and lawn mowers away can go a long way towards helping to keep your trees healthy. Herbicide damage is something that we might see around here occasionally. It's not so common in very urban areas. Usually herbicide damage is more likely to be seen in areas that might be adjacent to large farms, or possibly herbicides or other chemicals are being sprayed on fields. We can sometimes see chemical damage in urban trees in the form of salt stress or maybe oil damage. Salt stress is more common in trees up north where they salt the roads a lot in the winter. Salt can really stress and damage trees. And in highly urban areas, places like Atlanta, Chicago, and really big cities like that, we tend to see a lot of ozone damage, which is what you're seeing on the leaves of the tulip poplar in this picture here. But rarely is this a very serious issue or an issue that we commonly come across here in this area, although it is something to keep an eye out for. And it's also important to keep in mind that when you're applying herbicide or other chemicals to your lawn, or your neighbors are, there's always the potential for drift to occur that might damage the leaves of your trees or your neighbor's trees if chemicals are being applied improperly. Drought stress is a big one in our area. Again and again throughout this presentation, we've talked about the dangers of stressed trees on the landscape and why you should properly mulch your trees, why you should properly water your trees during the heat of the summer. This drought stress is so common in this region in the summer. This year we didn't see a lot of drought, but last year we saw a lot of drought stress on landscape trees in this area. And drought stress can lead to a lot of other issues, as we've been highlighting again and again throughout this talk. So reducing those impacts of drought stress, and also being sure to not overwater. Not so much of an issue around here, but still you want to be sure to not overwater your trees, because too much of a good thing is just too much, and that can lead to a lot of issues as well. Soil compaction is a commonly seen issue in landscape trees, but it's not usually something that people think of right away. Soil compaction can occur from that soil around the tree roots being pounded down again and again by construction, by cars driving around the root zone of that tree constantly. Maybe you put in a new driveway, or your neighbor put in a new driveway in the last few years. All the soil around a tree nearby may have been compacted and might impact the health of those tree roots and ultimately of the tree itself by leading to a lot of stress and creating conditions in which that tree can become much more stressed through that soil compaction, and possibly be a prime target for infectious agents such as disease or insects. So although soil compaction isn't something that we normally think about, I would say it's by far one of the more common issues that we see in urban and suburban areas around here with landscapes tree stress. It's just really compacted soils and those poor soils for trees to be in. Poor pruning and topping is also something that we see a lot around here. I'm not going to talk about this too much today. If you have any questions about proper pruning, I would be happy to try to answer them. But this could be 5 presentations in and of itself, just on poor pruning practices and how to properly prune trees. If you need to have your trees pruned, I would highly encourage you to find an arborist or another tree care professional to do this work, and to be sure that they know how to properly prune your trees. I see a lot of trees in our area that have been topped. This is not what you want to see on a landscape tree. This picture here, you never want to see a tree pruned like this. It's horrible, and it actually leads to a lot of issues for the tree, a lot of health issues down the line. So if you want to have your trees pruned, you know, check with who's going to be pruning them. You know, see if they have the right credentials to say that yes, they know how to do this work. They know how to properly prune your trees, because poor pruning is by far one of the most common stressors that we see around here with landscape trees. And just reducing the chance for improper pruning can go a long way to keeping your trees healthy. And nutrient deficiencies aren't super common around here. Sometimes we'll see iron chlorosis in trees, which is what you're seeing in this picture here. But nutrient deficiencies aren't you know, at the top of this list of what might lead to tree stress, but they can sometimes be found in landscape trees as well, especially in those nutrient poor soils that we have in so many suburban and urban areas. There might be some nutrient deficiencies. If you think that your trees might have nutrient deficiencies, I would encourage you to reach out to someone in your local extension service and see about having some testing done to look at what the nutrient profile might be like in your trees there. So we've been talking again and again about all these stressors in your landscape trees, and you're like, okay, everything's going to kill my landscape tree. It's just hopeless. But it's not. And there's a lot you can do to keep your trees healthy and to keep them healthy and beautiful for years to come. So we're going to talk about a list of like the top 5 things that I would recommend you do to make sure that your landscape trees are super happy and healthy and beautiful for a really long time. You know, first off, you know, you want the right tree in the right location. We've talked about this a little bit before with things like powdery mildew on dogwoods and lilacs, or not planting really large oak trees under power lines. You want to be sure that you're setting your trees up for success from the very beginning, from the moment that you plant them. So being sure that you know what kind of light requirements your tree has. Is this a tree that needs full sun all the time to be happy? Then don't plant it in an area that is mostly shaded in the afternoon. You know, don't plant species that really are water loving, like river birch, in areas that are going to have very dry soils where there's not going to be a lot of water available to them, because that can really stress out these water loving species. And don't plant trees that are going to get really large too close to houses where they might become a safety concern later on. Don't plant them under power lines. You know, understand the specifics of that species that you're planting and know what that tree is going to look like, not just right now, but in 20, 30, 50 years, so that you can better understand what the right location is for that species of tree. Because trees, unlike most animals and a lot of other organisms, they can't get up and move if they don't like the area. Once they're planted, they're stuck there. So being sure to set them up for success from the very beginning by planting them in the right location is really key to tree health. Making sure, on the same vein, to have the right species for the region. We talked about blue spruce a little bit earlier and how, I know they're beautiful, they have that gorgeous blue color, but they really don't do well in the Southeast. These aren't the right environmental conditions for them, and very, very often blue spruce can be under a lot of stress in landscapes here in the bluegrass region. So it's one of those species that I would recommend not putting on your landscape. There are a few others like this as well that they don't thrive in our area. They don't do well, and I know they look pretty, but ultimately they're probably going to have a lot of stress down the line and will have infectious pathogens or insects that might be impacting them. Native species very often do well in their native range, and I love encouraging native species to be planted, but there's also a number of ornamental species that will do really well on your landscape as well. So just checking to see where this tree does well, what kind of a region or a zone it really thrives in, will go a long way towards promoting the health of that tree down the line. Proper irrigation, proper watering when necessary is really important. And we've talked about proper irrigation and proper watering again and again throughout this presentation. But making sure that it's done the right way is just as key as irrigating it all. Like you see in this tree in the picture here, I don't know if you can really see very well, but there's this line from all of this lichen and algae that's growing on the trunk of this tree. And what you're seeing there is the irrigation line. That's where the sprinkler hits, where that algal growth stops. That's the top of where the sprinkler hits on this tree. So every day that sprinkler is hitting the tree at that point, and that algae is growing there. And while the algae isn't going to really hurt the tree in and of itself, it's not going to do anything to impact the health of a tree. It's a sign that that irrigation isn't going where it needs to. That tree isn't absorbing water through the bark. That irrigation needs to be hitting around the root zone of that tree and be absorbed into the soil to be effective. So, making sure that irrigation is effective, that it's going where you want it to, and also keeping in mind that in some cases, if irrigation and sprinkler systems are hitting the foliage a lot, all of that water sitting on the foliage might lead to sunburn on the leaves, and it might create a nice environment for some infectious pathogens, fungal or bacterial pathogens, to possibly infect the leaves of your trees if there's a lot of water sitting on them all the time. So if you're going to irrigate your trees, which I highly recommend in the heat of the summer, be sure that it's being done the right way. And there's some good information out there on proper irrigation as well, if this is something that you're curious about. Proper mulching techniques, we've already talked about this a little bit. Don't volcano mulch your trees. Don't pile all that mulch up right around the trunk of the tree. It's actually very, very detrimental and harmful to the health of the tree. It's a perfect spot for insects and disease to enter the bark of your tree. It leads to a lot of tree stress. It can lead to girdling roots. Poor mulching practices are actually one of the worst things you can do for the health of your tree. But if you mulch correctly, it can really, really improve the health of your landscape trees and reduce stress on them for a very long time. Mulch helps keep down competing plant matter. It helps retain moisture in the soil. There's so much that mulch can do that's really beneficial for trees, just as long as you're applying it correctly. And finally, proper pruning, which we already talked about a little bit. If you need to have your trees pruned, please be sure that whoever is doing that tree work for you is qualified to do so, that there's a tree care professional of some kind, and that when that pruning takes place, it's going to improve the aesthetic and the health of your tree and not possibly open up a sign for infection or other problems down the line, because improper pruning can very often lead to a whole host of other tree health issues if left, if it occurs. It can lead to a lot of issues in the years to come. There are a number of good resources available through UK and through other sources as well to help you with the health of your trees, help teach you about what you can do to keep your trees healthy, about how to plant trees correctly. There are so many excellent resources out there, and these are some that I highly recommend. University of Kentucky Forest Health, we have a Kentucky Tree Health website that is hosted in collaboration with several other departments at UK, people from plant pathology and entomology, really excellent professionals in tree health, have a lot of good information there. There's the Trees Are Good website, which has a lot of good information on properly planting and caring for your trees. The Healthy Woods app, which I think Dr. Crocker talked about just before this presentation, is a wonderful resource, as well as the Guide to Insect Pests of Woody Ornamentals, which can tell you a lot about what kind of insects might be impacting the health of your trees. I'd also really encourage you to keep up with us on social media. We are on Facebook. Kentucky Forest Health has a Facebook page, and we try to post information about invasive insects and new diseases that are cropping up, as well as just a lot of educational, as well as some really fun information on tree and forest health here in Kentucky. There's also the Kentucky Pest Newsletter and the Plant Disease Diagnostic Lab. These are just a few of the fantastic resources that are available to help you manage the health of your landscape trees. And if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. But I really appreciate you all being here today, taking the time to be with us and talk a little bit about what you can do to keep your landscape trees healthy, because they're beautiful. They provide us with so much joy and so many wonderful benefits. And if we keep them happy, they'll be around for a long time. So thank you all so much for being here today. And if you have any questions, I can definitely take this.